Did you know that a React server component is not allowed to be a child of a React client component? Well, just like this, there are a few other gotchas and things that you should know while building React server components and client components. So, in this video, we will be covering all of that by building a blog app together. So, let's get started. So let's take a look at this blog that we are going to use for demonstration reasons to learn the gotchas of React Server components. So this is a very simple blog and it is actually a trimmed down version of my actual blog on kulkarniankita.com/blog. So if you want to check out more blog posts, go there as well. But going back to our blog itself, we have two blog posts there and every blog post has a image URL, a title, and a date. Now we want to format the date a bit differently a bit later, but this is essentially the blog itself. Now if you click on every blog post, you can read more about the blog post. And that is essentially it. So the first gotcha is that you need to keep your client-side bundle small and you want to keep all the large dependencies onto the server. Because now we do have access to the server and we can structure our code in a way that our client-side bundle is smaller. So make sure to keep all the large dependencies on the server side in the server components. Let's take a look at an example. So let's take a look at the diagram and the architecture of our blog app. We have the blog app, which is on the /blog route. We have a card list component that wraps the two cards. And we also have every single card component like we saw in our example. This is a card component and the wrapper around it, around both the card components, is the card list component. Now, let's say that we want to format the specific date. It says 2022 0907, but we don't really want to do that. We want to say September 7th, 2022. Now, in that case, we want to use a package because date formatting can be tricky. So in this case, if we take a look at the page and head over to the card component, because that is where the date is being declared, we head over to the card component. At the bottom, you will see the date component. Now, if you open up date component, you will see that it's actually a client component. And what is card? Card is also a client component. Because card has use state handlers, React lifecycle hooks, card is in fact a client component. So date also needs to be a client component because if we make date a server component and which is a child of a client component, that is against the rules. You cannot do that. And we will take a look at that gotcha as well in a second. But for now, let's focus on making date into a server component so that we can take advantage of storing dependencies on the server side. So for that reason, let's replace the code which I have already prepared for us. So here I'm importing date FNS package, and then we are parsing the date, and then we are formatting the date. Pretty straightforward. This is exactly what we want. But if you go to card component, this is a client component. The second gotcha is that a server component cannot be a child of a client component. So in that case, what we could do is we need to change this code a little bit. We need to move this date code to the parent and pass it as a children. So let's see how we can do that. So now here, let's copy the date value, go to card list, and inside card, let's add the date component itself. And again, let's import date over here. And in value, let's add props.date. Now, card list is a server component and date is a server component. So this is doable and this is something that is totally allowed to do. But in card now, because now it's a child of a card component, we can go ahead and add, if the date exists, then let's call the children. And children is something that we need to add as a prop over here as well. This way we can invoke the children. So now if you take a look again, you can see that date is being rendered as expected. Now we have covered two gotchas in just this one thing. We have made date a server component, will not be included in the client-side bundle. And second, we have also run into the gotcha that a server component cannot be a child of the client component. And in this case, we could easily move date to a parent component. This way we can pass it as a child, and that is totally okay to do. This is something you really need to know to master server components. Now, if you want to learn React Server Components step by step, I have also created a free mini course for you to learn React Server Components, where you will get an email per day and you will learn React Server Components at your own pace. There's also a quiz at the end of each day. I will quiz you, and if you're able to answer it, you will get the next lesson right away. I've gamified it so that it's really fun while learning and building React Server Components. So if you're interested, go to reactservercomponents.dev. The next gotcha is that you cannot invoke create context inside a server component. It needs to be inside a client component. And you need to structure your app a little bit differently when you're using context and server components. So let's take a look at an example to show you how you can do so. Now let's say we want to add dark mode to our blog app. And in order to add dark mode to our blog app, you would typically think of creating a theme provider and storing the value dark or light inside the theme provider so that we can use context to pass that value to all the components, and you can manipulate the value anywhere you like. So you would think that the best place to do this would be the root layout. And a root layout is essentially a file inside the app directory. The layout file is the root layout file. And it's also called root layout when you create the Next.js project as well. Now, context providers are typically rendered at the root of the application so that we can share global concerns. And you would think of create context right here, because this is the perfect spot for it. But the gotcha here is that you cannot use create context here. You cannot invoke it right here because context is not supported inside React Server Components. Trying to create context at the root of the application is not going to work. It will cause an error, and you don't want that. So what you could do though is you could create a file called as theme provider. Again, we are calling theme context here. We are creating context and we are declaring the theme provider value with the value dark. Now, and we are using use client because that is the trick here. We need to make this theme provider file a client component. Since all of the context APIs are fully supported in client component, this is totally fine. And then if we go back to root layout, we can just pretty much declare it and call children. With the provider rendered at the root, all of the client components throughout our app will be able to consume this context. But let's say we were not to do that and we did not create theme provider a server component, then it's going to be a challenge because we will see an error. So if we comment this out, and you can see right here that maybe one of these should be marked as client entry with use client, because otherwise you are importing a component that needs create context. It only works in the client component, but none of its parents are marked as use client. So this will not work, just like we saw. But if I uncomment it, it's going to work as expected. So this is another gotcha that you really need to know in terms of how you can structure your components moving forward with React Server Components and context. You can start keeping all your sensitive information on the server. Now, typically, we use the backend of our application to store all the user-sensitive stuff, but also store API keys and so on. Now, just by using JavaScript, we can also just prefix next_public to any API key and make it available to the browser so that we could invoke any sort of client-side SDKs and so on. Now, obviously, we could also do that in the backend by using a server-side SDK and passing data to the client. This entire setup is really easy now because with server components, you can now store the client-side keys inside server components. So let's take a look at an example. Now with React Server Components, if you don't prefix anything with next public, it is going to be available to the server component. And then you can invoke whatever data that you want in a server component, and you can pass data as props to the other components. So now these were just a few gotchas to keep in mind when you start building React Server Components. Either you're adopting React Server Components for the app directory, or you are slowly moving to the app directory from the pages directory with Next.js. So make sure that you know all these gotchas. And that's all for this video. I'll see you in the next one.